Привit, my name is Alexa Gobosh, and today I will be interviewing Danylo Puderak, our 13th alumni of the Alumni video series. Danylo Puderak is the son and grandson of the post-World War II displaced person immigrants who arrived to Canada in the late 1940s and 1950s. Danylo was born and grew up in the dynamic prairie city of Saskatoon, where he graduated from the University of Saskatchewan with a degree in History and Ukrainian Studies. He later completed his CERTESL to teach English as a second language overseas in Ukraine at the University of Saskatchewan Centre for Second Languages, as well as the Saskatoon Open Door Society. For the past 19 years, Danylo has worked as the executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress of Saskatchewan. Okay, let's get started.
Добрий ранок, Олекса. Слава Україні.
Героям слава. First question, where did you go to university and what did you study?
So I graduated, attended the University of Saskatchewan here in Saskatoon, and my degree is a combined BA in History and Ukrainian Studies.
And what was your role in SUSK at the time or in your Ukrainian student organization?
So interesting little story. My first week as a freshie in university, I was walking through the tunnel, and the tunnel's this underground, literally it's a tunnel that connects the Student Union building with the Arts Tower. And during Welcome Week, the university clubs have tables set up, and it's their way of registering and engaging with new members. And a fellow by the name of Oris Novosad, who had graduated from my high school the year before, saw me and grabbed me and said, "You have to sign up for the Ukrainian Students Club." And so I joined the Ukrainian Students Club, and that was my first taste of student or university Ukrainian student life, and it was a really great experience. So yeah. That from there, I was involved with the club for many years. In that initial year, you don't get as involved. You're sort of checking everything out and getting to know people, and then from there it advanced to being on the executive. And then I was very fortunate to get involved with SUSK at the national level. I believe my first Congress that I attended was in Ottawa. And at the time, Greg Bazniuk was the president, and I got onto the executive and would later become national president and served for a year in 1991.
The first thing I'm going to mention is that I'm very jealous you've had an in-person Congress. We're super excited. We're currently planning to have one in Edmonton, actually, but it's in the works. With COVID, it's a little bit hard to organize or tell what the future is going to hold, but we're super excited, and I'm really happy to hear that. What were some of the events? Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, all I was going to say is it's one of the unfortunate realities of COVID is that a lot of these one-on-one in-person experiences are really missing. It's so important that we are able to get together in person and get to know one another, not just at that level, the formal level of being involved in an organization together, but at the social level, because it's about when you're involved in an organization, you want to be friends and socialize with the people that you're involved in. We've learned many things, and it's the pandemic has certainly provided new opportunities. For example, doing these kinds of interviews or meetings virtually, which when I was involved with USK and SUSK, that was not available. It's like the internet, what's that, and so it was a much greater challenge to connect with your branches and with your colleagues across the country. And that's where those in-person congresses, and back then we also had an Eastern Conference and a Western Conference to bring together the regional clubs, and those are important because it gave everybody a chance to come together and get to know one another.
Yeah, that's very important nowadays. I feel like now we all seem so disconnected, and we're just finding our best ways to just connect each other once again, whether that's virtual games night, networking nights, alumni success series. We're just doing our best, and we're all just craving to be back to normal nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations for doing things like this alumni video series, because I think it's a really great, it's so important to be connected with the alumni and have the support of and show for your members the long and diverse and interesting history that SUSK has had in Canada.
100%. I think that now are the best way for us to get the greatest turnover when it comes to a change in executive is to show them what we did in the past and to have our alumni talk about the importance, how they enjoyed it, what they did. So I think that that's the best part of these alumni success series.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I mean, I know you've got some questions set out here, but we seem to be having a really great dialogue that's taking us in different directions. But an important thing that you that you're raising here is that idea of understanding the organization's history and the things that it did. But it doesn't mean that we're about, or any organization is about repeating that, because you don't, right?
Yep.
You're about understanding what the core values are. You're understanding the successes, the challenges, and yet you are setting a new direction that is a way that to respond to who your members are today and what their priorities are and what the priorities of a Ukrainian Students Association in Canada are.
Yeah, we always see that in our student issues. If you look back, it's really interesting because you could see what they were doing at the time and how Congress was organized differently, how different events were organized differently. And now we're talking about how a pandemic affected us. Back then, we were talking about how different things happening in the world at that time were affecting them. And I think the thing about those student issues is we link the past and we learn from it, we grow from it. And that's the very important part of having a national organization like that.
Interestingly enough, one of the common issues that if you go back and look at the student from the 1970s and 80s and today is the Russian threat.
Yeah.
You know, back then it was all about the threat of the Soviet Union and the Russification policies, the threat to the Ukrainian identity, the nation, and we're seeing that again, unfortunately, today, even with an independent Ukraine and all the progress that Ukraine has made. So, you know, a lot of things change, but many things change or stay the same.
I know. What were some of the events or projects you were involved with when you were still part of SUSK?
Well, you know, my tenure with SUSK was, as president, was 1 year. It was 1991. Things were very different. This is when the Soviet Union was falling apart. This is when Ukraine declared its independence. So we were witnessing was dramatic change taking place in Ukraine. Here in Canada, amongst the clubs, we were facing many different challenges. It was, you know, the reality is when you're dealing with a university student club is that there's a fluidity to those organizations. People come and go, and so you know, people are focused on their studies, but there's that, you know, there's still that connection to the students clubs. So the existence of certain clubs would come and go as well. So it was very difficult at that time. I would say that 1990s, you know, the early 90s period was a very difficult time for SUSK to as an organization. So those were some of the things that we were facing back then. The Ukrainian Students Club at the University of Saskatchewan was one of the, I would say, more active clubs. We were very fortunate that so we had our own space. There was a part of the university where they had you know, club spaces made available, and we had a fairly large space, and it became a what would you call it, a place, a chill place where you know, members could come and just hang out any time of day. They'd hang, you know, we had you know, they'd be playing cards, they'd be eating or whatever, and socializing, which was so important when you're trying to have that kind of you're building that bond between people, those friendships. So the club was very active. We would organize zabavas, we would organize different kinds of political events to inform people about what's going on in Ukraine at the time, and so from that standpoint, there was always something to keep us busy and to get people to volunteer. And again, at the national level, it was a more of a challenge because there was you're dealing with other clubs that were struggling, and so what can you do? I mean, SUSK is very fortunate now to have a national coordinator that can provide that kind of support to those clubs that are needing it, but back then it was a little bit different.
Yes, we give many thanks to our national coordinator, and we have our individual VPs, our vice presidents, and what their main goal is usually is to try to reboot these USOs and these clubs that are either struggling, or we are trying to find our friends. We're communicating, we're like, hey, like, would you want to start a club in your university? So that's how we, like, our network continues to grow.
Right.
But we see the importance of making sure that there is a national coordinator that helps us unite the club, and she provides a lot of support to each executive on our board.
Absolutely.
And sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
What is your current occupation?
So currently, and for the past 19 years, I've been the executive director with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress of Saskatchewan. It's rare that a person finds a job that when you wake up in the morning, you're happy to be going to work, and certainly that's been my case these past 19 years with UCC in Saskatchewan. I was somebody that didn't necessarily grow up in the Ukrainian community, really a late bloomer in many respects. I started Ukrainian dancing when I was in high school. I joined the Ukrainian Students Club in university. I started studying Ukrainian in university. And so that's when my involvement really started to flourish as a volunteer and as a member of the Ukrainian community. And so, I learned a lot from that. I learned, one of the things is I realized that my experience is in many ways the experience of, I would say, the majority of Ukrainian Canadians. We talk about currently 1.3, 1.4 million Ukrainians in Canada. That doesn't mean everybody is involved in the Ukrainian community, right? They self-identify somehow. And so there is an organized community that sometimes isn't always the most easy to get into, or to be a part of, or to be welcomed into. And so that experience growing up really taught me a lot, that I need to, or we, UCC as an organization, as the umbrella, needs to find a way that we can be more welcoming, that we can be more supportive, that we can be a place where Ukrainian Canadians self-identifying and that want to be involved can find a place and can get involved. And in recent years, that's also extended to Ukrainian newcomers, because in Saskatchewan, over the past 15 years or so, we've seen an uptick in the number of immigrants from Ukraine that are choosing Saskatchewan to build their lives. And so we want to welcome them into our community and ensure that they can find a place to feel at home here.
I think that's very important, since whenever I think of Saskatchewan, I think of the hub of Ukrainians, that everyone, when I think of the past, of the history, I just think of Saskatchewan. Even, this is a funny story, even when my parents are once buying a car somewhere, we were talking to the car dealer, and all of a sudden he's like, what language are you speaking? And then we say, we're Ukrainian, and he's like, oh, I'm 6th generation Ukrainian. And I was like, what are the odds? And he's like, my grandparents and none of his grandparents ever told him anything about the Ukrainian organization or the Ukrainian community. He says all he knew was his great-great-grandmother told her about how when she first came to Ukraine, they had to stay safe. Obviously, the times were different there. When you're coming, they were coming to farms, right? So they were literally digging holes to keep themselves warm during the winter. Obviously, those are post-world times. And so then he was just telling us all this past, but he's like, in the end of it, he says, but I'm not involved in my Ukrainian community. I was just like, it's never too late to start. He's like, I don't speak Ukrainian. I was like, your knowledge of Ukrainian language obviously is beneficial, but in no way is that a must to join our Ukrainian community. So I think that's very important, as how you said, it's really hard for us And we should be encouraging more individuals to join our Ukrainian community, no matter if they are fifth generation Ukrainians or just came from Ukraine, immigrated from Ukraine.
Well, you raise a really important point, Alexa, because the Ukrainian community has changed, obviously. I mean, dramatically since those 1920s and 30s, etc. And you point out, I mean, Saskatchewan at one time, I mean, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada was founded in Saskatoon. The Ukrainian National Foundation, UNO, was founded in Saskatoon. So the prairies in Saskatchewan were, you said, hotbeds of the Ukrainian community back then. And so we have a proud history, but we also need to realize that people's values, their connection to the community have changed, and it doesn't mean that they're any less Ukrainian. If they want to be, if they choose to be a part of that, and we have a really dynamic culture, we have a very proud history. We have very many, I mean, from music to the arts and culture, there's many things that we can point to that tell our story and are really exciting and fascinating and interesting. And so if people want to be a part of that, then we need to make sure that they can be a part of that. There was a time, and when I was growing up, I think I mentioned that I didn't speak Ukrainian. I didn't start studying Ukrainian until Dr. Roma Franco started teaching me in first year university at the University of Saskatchewan. And it wasn't until I started going to Ukraine and spending time there as a student initially, and then working there, that I was able to become fluent in the language. But people were judgmental, and there's still some people that are judgmental if you don't speak Ukrainian. I'm fluent in Ukrainian, but I often make a point of speaking English because the fact is most people don't speak Ukrainian, and yet they want to be a part of the community. So we need to make them feel welcome and ensure that at meetings, whether it's whatever the organization, that people are able to express themselves and understand what's going on in the language that they're able to communicate in.
I think that's also super important when we talk about what the Russian aggression is occurring right now in Ukraine, is that you want to make posts that are bilingual in I was going to say French, Ukrainian, English, so that every large majority of Canadians here are understanding what's happening, especially if you know more than one language. If you know Portuguese, Italian, Polish, any language, it's really important for you to send that message across, whatever language it is, because we're not going to educate everyone if we only speak one language, of course.
And it's also, I mean, with the Russian aggression issue, and the potential for continued invasion, it's not just about informing Ukrainians. It's about our neighbors and friends that are Nigerian or Chilean or whatever their ethnicity is here in Canada, so that they understand what's going on there and the impact potentially that they can have on or that this can have on the world and our security as a country. So yeah, absolutely, that diversity is so important.
I always do my best to share posts that talk about the importance of how something like a war in Ukraine breaking out affecting every other country around Europe, that it's not only us, that this affects so many large countries around us. And we are one of the largest countries, obviously, in Europe. So it's really important for people to see how this would affect other countries surrounding us. And I think that's something that's very hard for people to understand, because I feel like Ukraine sometimes has this sort of, not reputation, but it has people don't understand the importance of Ukraine. They see that Ukrainians are also proud, that we have this strong culture, this tradition, but they don't realize how our nation affects their nation and the neighbors in Canada itself.
Mm-hmm. It's true, and that's one of the struggles that that the Canadian government, that the Western allies are having, because those countries that are bordering Ukraine, like Poland, like Romania, like Slovakia and Hungary, they know the potential threat immediately because it's their border, right? Whereby those further away, like France and Germany, they're more concerned about some of the economic potential impact on them and don't see the threat so much as being on their border. So it's it's trying to find that balance and convince them that no, I mean, we don't need to see another Iron Curtain going up along the Dnipro and a divided Ukraine with Western Ukraine as a buffer zone to a revamped Russian Empire, right? So, but anyways, that's sort of off topic, I think, for our discussion around SUSK. But again, it's historically, I think, when people look back at this video in the SUSK archives, they'll understand it. We're talking about something that's very relevant for these
Very
times.
relevant and happening
Yes.
right now. It's not like we're talking about the past.
That's right.
Okay, so what are some of the tasks or projects you are currently involved in while working as the executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress Saskatchewan Provincial Council?
Yeah. So I think I'd mentioned some of my priorities as an individual coming into this job, and it really was evolving an organization to that fulfilled a mandate that was broad, that was inclusive, that was contemporary, and that was forward-looking. So we have over the years looked at things that and programs that were for example looking to settlement services for newcomers. This was an area where we would be able to build bridges as an organization, as a community, to the newest members of our community that were coming in. And so we had up until recently settlement advisors that would assist with newcomers with meeting some of their immediate needs, finding places to live, getting social insurance numbers, health cards, et cetera, et cetera. We also provide translation interpretation services. So again, it's it comes from providing a service for newcomers, but not only, because people, established Ukrainian Canadians are often, say, doing genealogical or other work, and they have documents that they need translated, and so we're able to provide that kind of assistance. Community development, finding ways or responding to the needs of our members to to carry out their activities. One of the biggest challenges that organizations have is funding. And so we've been able to, over these past 19 years, develop what we call currently the Hromada Legacy Fund. And it's a grants program that member groups, individuals, non-Ukrainian groups can apply to for Ukrainian cultural and other activities. And so we've gone from, when I started, there were maybe $5,000 in grants that or support that was given out, to now we're in the range of $40,000 to $50,000 per year in grants that we provide out. And it was so important these past 2 years during the pandemic, because most of our groups weren't able to undertake fundraising activities. The summer camps were closed, and so it means that they've got no revenues coming in from registrations, yet they still need to support their buildings and their camps. Same thing with many of the other organizations. So we were able to provide special pandemic funding out of Hromada Legacy Fund to help those groups. And that's where I see that we are able to have an impact, a positive impact on those members, to help them make their, cope and get through this pandemic. The other thing that we've been doing is finding ways or creating ways for people to volunteer in the community, supporting volunteer activities that are going on. And also keeping in mind that we want to have a diverse volunteer body. So, as an organization, when we look to our board of directors, when we look to our committees, we're always conscious of the fact that we need to have things like a good gender balance or good regional representation, young and old members on the board. That diversity is so important because it brings different perspectives to the boarding and committee tables. So those are things that from an organizational standpoint, that I've worked hard to implement. Um, so yeah, I mean, good governance is certainly an important part of it. Supporting our member organizations, and our structure in Saskatchewan is a little bit different. Basically, we have 7 UCC Saskatchewan branches, regional branches. Not all are members of UCC National. Uh, uh, and yes, it's an interesting. It's like, why is that? Well, the history of the organization, right? When branches of UCC National were established, the local branches came before the provincial councils. And the local branches, so there are 4 in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, Regina, Kenora, and Yorkton. They followed the national model where you'd have, these national organizations like Ukrainian National Federation or the Ukrainian Catholic Women's League, or et cetera, Ukrainian Women's Organization. Their local branches, those would form local UC branches. But we also looked to find ways to have representative in other areas. So North Battlefords, Prince Albert, Weyburn, they don't follow those traditional models, so they couldn't be branches of national. They were branches of the provincial council, and there was a way of bringing them to the board table and engaging with them as well. So yeah, that was that's the way we're structured here. And we're trying to find ways to be as inclusive and representative of the community as possible.
I think I found it was really interesting to find 2 different parallels that we have amongst our SUSK, Союз Українських студентів Канади, is how you have a broad volunteer aspect, and we also have a volunteer award, and how you have project grants. We also provide project grants to our USOs, where if they need help to host an event where they do need extra funding, they could always reach out to us, talk about their project, their plan, and then we also fund and help fund a certain project. So it's interesting how we have similar patterns on a national level of an organization like UCC and a national level of a student organization,
and
where we learn from one another.
Yeah, well, and what you're doing is fantastic, because a little can go a long way. For many organizations, those grants don't need to be a lot, but they can have a really important impact in getting their their projects, their activities done. So well done on that.
Okay, next question. I know we spoke about your passion for community involvement, so I didn't want to delve into that. And how do you think your involvement in SUSK developed your passion for the community development?
Again, I'll just go back to the comments I made earlier about growing up as not from within the Ukrainian community, but somebody who came to it later in the game. And so that really has guided me in wanting to ensure that the work that we're doing as a community is inclusive, is welcoming, and that our organizations are sort of keeping up with the changes that are taking place. Or I mean, not all organizations are able to do that. SUSK, I mean, we talked about the importance of understanding our history, but looking at our values, looking at our mandates, looking at our objectives as organizations, and ensuring that we're keeping up with the times and looking forward, right? So that's what's really important for us and for me as executive director in UCC Saskatchewan as well, that not that there's 140,000 approximately Ukrainians in Saskatchewan. And the more that we can engage with them, the more that they can find a place in our community as volunteers, as leaders, as supporters, the stronger that we are going to be as a community going forward. And so organizational development I see as the way to making that happen.
And I have one last question. What is some advice you'd give current SUSK members or students involved in their current student organizations?
So one of the things that was so important when I was involved with the Ukrainian Students Club and SUSK was building personal relationships with people. It was, and to this day, I have friends that I had made when I was involved with USK and SUSK, and we remain friends, and it's like, we don't necessarily see each other that often because they're from different parts of the country, but when we get together, it's like we pick up from where we left off the last time. You really do make lifelong connections, and can, through an organization like the Ukrainian Students organizations or SUSK. So what I would stress is that that all organizations, the clubs, should find ways to create those social opportunities as much as possible, pandemic aside, where your people are just able to connect at that individual level, get to know one another, become friends, and then extend that to the regional and the national levels. If there's ways for clubs in certain regions to do things jointly or get together socially, do it. I mean, I remember going to, for us in the prairies, it's no big deal to drive 5 hours from Saskatoon to Edmonton to go to a Zabava on the weekend, or we would have we in Saskatoon, we host Vesna Festival every year, so people from Winnipeg or Edmonton would drive in for the weekend just to have a good time. And it's amazing because you make those connections and they last a lifetime. So that would be my bit of advice for you is make sure that you're focusing on networking, on connections, and on the personal relationships.
Thank you so much for the advice. I have never heard of somebody driving 5 hours for Zababa, but I will mention that next time somebody says they're dedicated, because that is dedication.
That is fun,
That's fun.
and it's so common for here on the prairies for people to do that. Yeah.
That's fun. Okay, so moving forward, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much
My
for sharing
pleasure.
your passion for community involvement. I'm sure it will inspire many SUSK and USO members. Дуже дякую.
Well, thank you for your patience, Alexa, and for reaching out. And I'm glad that we were finally able to have this conversation. It's been great, and best wishes to you with all your SUSK activities and in your schooling.
Thank you so much. Дуже дякую.
Тримайся, па-па.